Welcome back, pinball fans. Butch Peel with Jersey Jack Pinball. We're going to continue our look in detail at some of the more common playfield assemblies in pinball. Today's focus will be the pop bumper assembly. There's 4 of them on this Wizard of Oz game. Let's not waste any more time looking at my face. Let's start talking some pinball. Here we have a pop bumper assembly demonstration device that I put together using a piece of plexiglass as the playfield, and of course many of our parts. It's completely wired into my Wizard of Oz pinball machine, so the coil is connected as well as the switch that activates it. So it's fully functional. This is what the assembly looks like from the underside. See, I can trigger it again here. A quick word of caution: when you're working underneath the playfield and the game's power is on and the coin door is closed, these coils will all be energized. The high voltage is turned on. So in this particular assembly, you need to watch out for these 2 lugs here. They both have 70 volts on them. So if you touch that, you will know it. Anybody helping you gets up against there, the knuckle, anything will get a good shock there. So you've got to be really careful. The switches, on the other hand, are low voltage, so you can touch the blades and the contacts and all that. However, there's a biting type of danger also. If you close the switch that activates some of these switch activated assemblies like a pop bumper is, the thing will kick. It's going to kick, and it's going to kick just like a ball hit it. And if your finger gets in between there, you can get smashed pretty good. So again, be careful with the power on the 2 lugs. Be careful with activating devices, interrupting optos, things like that with your fingers that may trigger a device to kick. Can smash your finger pretty good. So just as a general rule, it's better to work on your game under the playfield with the power off, unless you absolutely need to use power to test something. So just keep that in mind. Pop bumper adjustments deal exclusively with the switch that activates the pop bumper. I'm going to zoom in a little bit here. Where the switch and bracket is mounted on the playfield and how well it's aligned with the actuator that's coming through the playfield on the skirt is very important. That's one point of adjustment. And the other is the sensitivity of the switch itself. That is, how close the blades are together, how well they're gapped. The key parts in mounting a pop bumper switch correctly and aligning it properly are shown here. The pop bumper skirt, which sits on top of the playfield, goes through the pop bumper body and base, through the playfield, sticks out the bottom, and the actuator for the switch, which is on the very end of it here, that needs to ride exactly in this pop bumper switch spoon. So it needs to fit right in the center of that. Not up on the edge, not in anywhere around the outside of this, right down in the center. It's very, very important that it ride there. So how you get it there is you attach this pop bumper switch using the 2 holes in the playfield, and it has oval type mounting holes. So there's some freedom to move it around and twist it and do those sorts of things, so that this will be held in place by the pop bumper body and screws and springs and everything that they go through the playfield. And this switch, then you need to bring it up there and put it directly in the center of that spoon as you mount the 2 screws and tighten them down firmly. And you can kind of see through the spoon there that it's got a translucent, so you can see when that actuator is not in the center. Now it's in the center. So you're going to have to move this around, adjust it, tighten it, check it, do 1 screw at a time. I usually start with the screw closest to the actuator. Screw it down, get it pretty snug, then snug the back screw, check my alignment, and then go back to the front screw, tighten it a little more, back screw, and go back and forth like that, making sure that the spoon doesn't travel or twist or move and get off of that actuator. It needs to be right in the center. That's very important. So if we look at the underside of the assembly, and I zoom in just a little bit here on the switch, you'll be able to see how well that spoon is centered on the actuator coming through the playfield from the pop bumper skirt. If I back out again, you can see what's going on here. As the ball comes in, pushes against the skirt, it forces that actuator uphill a little bit inside that spoon, and that actually causes the switch to close. And it doesn't matter what direction the ball comes from, as long as that actuator is in the direct center of that spoon. So ball hits, pushes, closes the switch, tells the computer fire the pop bumper. There's a ball sitting on the skirt right now. It kicks, pulls the plunger in here, and this makes contact with the ball, forces it against the top surface of the playfield and kicks it away from the pop bumper. The real advantage of a plexiglass playfield, to show you what's going on here, and I zoom in a bit. See the actuator on the spoon. Now the ball can come from any direction. Still has the same effect. If I zoom in real tight on the profile of the switch itself, you see that how well that's gapped determines the sensitivity. That is how far this pop bumper skirt has to be pushed off of the center of the spoon there for the actuator to make contact with the two blades. And that switch gap can be set extremely small so that the pop bumper is very sensitive, and it'll work well from all directions, so long, again, as that actuator is in the dead center of that spoon and held in place firmly. Another important point to make while I'm in really tight on the switch here is you don't want any gap whatsoever between this blade and that spoon actuator. You see how that touches the back of the spoon. That's critical. If there becomes a gap in there and you start trying to adjust your gap of your switch where it's not touching the spoon, then the spoon doesn't move enough to hit that blade, and your pop bumper is still very weak, doesn't react very well to the switch. It's very, very important that that blade touch the back of that, and then that you gap using, like we did with our flipper cabinet switch, this stiffener here to adjust our gap. Never adjust this blade right here. It should always be right next to the back of that spoon. This is your adjustment, and you don't bend the blade. The blade has got positive pressure back against the stiffener, and you use your switch adjuster to adjust the stiffener and thereby change the gap. So a good way to avoid that gap occurring between the bottom blade of my switch and my spoon is to use my switch adjuster when I go to put a new switch on, and I bend near the stack again, just slightly downward, so that I make sure that that bottom blade is contacting this spoon. And when I add this to the bottom of the playfield, it's going to push against the bottom of the actuator part of the skirt, and it's going to push that gap closed even more. And then I'll make my adjustment using the stiffener up there. So I want to make sure I have good positive pressure though between that bottom blade and the spoon. So when I'm adjusting my pop bumper switches, I like to lean my playfield up against the back box and get alongside the game, so I'm looking parallel to the back surface of the playfield. And then I kind of get where I can see both of the blades on my pop bumper switch, like I'm looking here, and maybe get something like find something in the background that's white, or maybe put a business card in here and make it a little easier to track that gap as I'm changing it. So just anything you can do to get where you can look at both of the blades perfectly in parallel and find something light in the background between them so that you can see the gap a little better. Really helps a lot. I've got everything plugged back in again. All the wires for the switch are connected again, so I'm going to zoom out a little bit here and show you how little movement off of perfectly vertical with that actuator. It doesn't take much at all to trigger that pop bumper. in any direction. Now if you get your pop bumper switch gapped too tightly and it's stuck closed, the game knows that. You notice when I hold down the actuator, the pop bumper kicks once and stops. Even though the switch is still closed right now, it takes another opening and closing of the switch to re-trigger it. So your game won't sit there locked on like some of the old Williams games used to do if that pop bumper switch is stuck closed. And you'll get a notification in your error messages when you power your game up telling you to check that switch because it's stuck closed. Now I know what you're thinking. I sound like a broken record here telling you you've got to get that actuator right in the center of that spoon in order for your pop bumper to work well. And you're saying, yeah, I got it, enough, you don't have to tell me anymore. But that's kind of hard to see under there, Butch. How in the heck do I see where that actuator is? How can I tell if it's right in the middle there when I'm working on a real play field here, not your plexiglass toy here? Well, there are a couple of tricks that you can use to see if it's centered, in fact. One of them is to push on the spoon itself, like I'm doing right here. Push down on the back of the switch and the spoon, and if you see the actuator move to one side or the other, it's not in the center. If it's dead center, it won't move when I do that. Another way of doing it is to pull back on it and watch this actuator. Does it move side to side? This one's well aligned. In a minute here I'll take it apart and I'll make it where it's not aligned and show you how one looks that is not aligned properly. Okay, so I took the screws loose on the mounting bracket for the switch and deliberately misaligned this one so it's not in the center anymore. When I push on this now, watch what the actuator does. When I lift on it, what is the actuator doing? It's moving. So that's telling me which direction it needs to go. See, I'm forcing it back to center by pushing on it, and that's forcing it to bend. And if you misadjust a switch like this, it'll be very sensitive only in the direction in which it's off center. Every other direction, the sensitivity will either be diminished or non-existent because it's just not going to be able to push on that skirt quite enough to make it make contact. So again, lifting and pushing. So it tells me the center needs to go that way because I'm seeing how that's moving each time. It's moving back away from me, so I need to loosen the screws and slide the whole switch over until that's in the center and tighten it back down again. And that's how you can tell. Pop bumper is a very, very violent mechanism, again, kind of like a flipper. There's a lot of vibration in the mechanism underneath the playfield. So when the pop bumper kicks, it vibrates all of this quite a bit. And what tends to happen when the pop bumper is not working, 9 times out of 10 is because a wire either broke off of the coil or a wire broke off of the switch because of all the vibration in that area because the pop bumper is kicking all the time. So this is basically all you see of a pop bumper above the playfield surface. Ball comes along, hits the skirt from some direction, pop bumper pops and forces the ball away with the ring and rod assembly, which is this metal part here. That's the ring, and then the rods hold it underneath to the plunger. So you need to keep an eye on your pop bumpers and make sure they're working at all times, because they are generally set on the playfield in groups of 3, 4, 2, and they tend to fight with one another a little bit. So one pop bumper kicks the ball and it knocks it into another pop bumper. That pop bumper kicks it back towards the other pop bumper. If these pop bumpers, any one of them, stops working, I like to say it can't protect itself or can't defend itself anymore. So when a ball smashes into it, if the switch is not working or the coil is disconnected or something like that, it doesn't actuate and the ball smashes right into the plastic body of the pop bumper. That's very bad because it can crack and break it. We all know when plastic and steel meet which one's going to win. So we need to make sure our pop bumpers are working all the time so that they can defend themselves and make the ball kick around like they're supposed to and make things lively in a pinball game. So this is the above view of the pop bumper. It's got a typical pop bumper cap on it. 2 Phillips screws hold it in place. Depending upon the game and whether it's a limited edition or a standard, there might be different types of artwork or plastic pieces or even 3D sculptures on top of the pop bumper itself. But you'll need to remove those if you want to work on the pop bumper itself, if you want to pull it off of the playfield. In this case, you use a number 1 Phillips screwdriver to remove the 2 Phillips head screws and remove the pop bumper cap. So I've removed the pop bumper cap, and you can see inside this particular bumper has a 12 volt LED, 3 LED light in it. Or again, with some games we'll have a RGB LED board inside there. Different ways to light the bumper. Some of them aren't lit at all, in fact, like in Wizard of Oz. So the first thing I need to check is above the playfield, and that's how tight this pop bumper body is. It's held in place by these 2 Phillips screws. That's a number 2 Phillips screwdriver that you use to tighten those, and they actually screw the bumper body, sandwich the skirt and the base and a spring all together and screw them into the surface of the playfield. And this should be very, very tight. You should not be able to wiggle a pop bumper body back and forth with your hand. If it is at all loose, you need to tighten those 2 screws and get this pop bumper body tight. It's going to get smashed and vibrated around with the ball. It needs to be very tight. So when I reattach my pop bumper cap to my pop bumper body, I use 2 of these sheet metal screws. So they have a point to them, they're not machine screws, and that means that there are threads cut in this plastic pop bumper body that I need to align with the threads on this screw. Same as when I put something into the bottom of my playfield. So what I want to do is use a number 1 screwdriver, like I said, a Phillips, and I want to go backward. I want to go counterclockwise and light pressure until I hear a click. There it is. Now I start going forward, and now I've aligned the screw with the threads that are already cut in the pop bumper body. Do this one also. Listen. There it went. Now I go forward, and when I tighten those down, they will tighten down every time. If I just put a screw in there and start going clockwise and start screwing and cross thread what's already cut inside that plastic pop bumper body, then I'm going to eventually get to the point where they're stripped out after a few times of doing that, and I won't be able to tighten that pop bumper cap onto that pop bumper body anymore. Same thing with wooden holes. Things you'll need to check underneath the playfield periodically for tightness are shown here. So you've put a lot of effort into getting this switch aligned properly with the actuator there. You want to make sure that that stays tight, so these 2 screws need to be good and tight all the time. Remember, a lot of vibration going on around this pop bumper. If you look up underneath where the 2 yoke pieces and the plunger here attached to the rods of the ring and rod assembly in 2 places, there's a 632 lock nut on each of those. They have a threaded end on the rods, and those lock nuts from time to time will work their way loose and fall off. You need to make sure they stay on tight. That's what allows the pop bumper to pull that ring and rod assembly down. When I say tight on these 2 632 lock nuts that are holding the yokes to the ring and rod assembly, I'm just talking snug. It's very important that they not be over tightened. So if you over tighten them, you can break the threaded portion right off the end of the rod, which is not too hard to do actually, and then you have to replace that whole piece. So you don't want to do that. You want to make sure they're just snug. So you're bringing your driver down and you're turning. When you meet the resistance of hitting the yoke, you stop. And make it good and snug, and that's good on both sides, and make sure they stay that way. It's a good idea to keep an eye on your switch as well. Make sure none of the blades break off and this spoon stays in one piece. Sometimes the actuator will wear a small hole right in the bottom of that spoon, and then it causes your pop bumper to not work properly. Sometimes the spoon breaks off. I've seen that before too, over long periods of time. They get a little brittle. It's a plastic part. So just keep an eye on that. Make sure everything's working well. Your diodes and everything are attached to your switch well, and wiring, all those kinds of things. On the back side of the pop bumper bracket, you see the 2 screws that hold the coil in place. They mount into a bracket on the opposite side that holds the coil in. Those need to be tight. You need your coil held in place firmly all the time. And then these are the 2 wires that hook into that little light that's inside the pop bumper. With these 3 632 screws here need to be tight also, and you don't want to over tighten those, and I'll explain why in just a second here. So the screw used to hold in these three places here, hold the bracket of the pop bumper on the underside of the playfield, is actually a screw nail. It's got a fin shank on it here, and it's driven through from the top side of the playfield, and the fin keeps the nail from twisting underneath when you put on these 632 nylon lock nuts and hold your pop bumper in place. But when you over tighten that, you can actually pull on this through the playfield, and you can make this screw nail want to come through the playfield and make an indentation in the top side of your playfield. So you don't want to over tighten these. You want them to be good and snug and this to be solidly mounted. However, do not over tighten them. Here I've backed off one of the 632 nylon lock nuts off of one of these screw nails just to make another point here. If I'm removing that bracket or I'm putting it back on, and I've got my driver here on top of that lock nut, I don't want to apply a lot of pressure as I'm putting the lock nut in. I just want to twist it and let the lock nut pull itself all the way on. With that gap in there, like is shown here, if I put pressure on this, I will push this screw nail back up through the top of the playfield, and it'll start spinning on top, and that shank will act like a drill bit and tear up the top of my playfield. Very, very bad thing for that to happen. So whenever you're either tightening or loosening these three lock nuts, no upward pressure through the playfield. You're just enough to get the driver onto the lock nut and then turn it without applying a lot of pressure. Very important. Okay, wear parts and things like that you'll need to kind of keep an eye on that might need to be replaced from time to time. Underneath the playfield there's a spring that pushes the ring and rod assembly back up to its rest position. If that spring breaks over time and it's getting compressed over and over again every time the pop bumper kicks, it can cause your ring and rod assembly to only go back up about half height or something like that and not work real well. It won't give a good kick because it's only traveling half as far now. So keep an eye on that. Make sure that your spring stays in good shape. Your pop bumper will work better. This metal piece right up on top of here, the top yoke piece, there's a fiber yoke and there's a metal yoke, a steel yoke. That steel one can break right in the center there. It'll break right in half, and then these two pieces will kind of twist outward, and you'll notice that things don't look well aligned anymore. So look up under the playfield, check on this metal piece from time to time, make sure it's in one piece and in good shape, and your pop bumper will work better also. The ring and rod assembly itself can fail. It has threaded ends on the rods, one for hooking into the yokes underneath the playfield, and then one above to hold to the ring assembly. So if either one of these ends breaks off of either one of these, your pop bumper's only working about half as well as it should. So keep an eye on those. If you find pieces of threaded material with a 632 nut on it in the bottom of your cabinet, it's likely one of these is broken off. So you'll need to replace just the rod that's broken. What's kind of nice about the Jersey Jack part is that you can just replace one piece instead of the entire piece when your ring and rod assembly breaks. A couple of last things to mention are the plastic pop bumper body and skirt pieces. These can break over time, especially if the pop bumper stops working for some reason, can't defend itself. Like I mentioned earlier, the body can get broken and cracked. Over long periods of time, usually these skirts will get a little bit fragile, a little bit brittle. They dry out and they'll start chipping and little chunks will be popping out of them. And then it's time to replace them. But that's quite a ways down the road. And if you keep everything else working well, your bodies will stay in one piece for quite some time too. Well, I've tried to squeeze as much information that I can into this short video that I've learned about pop bumpers over the past 35 years or so working on pinball. I hope you find the information useful. Until you pop back in for a new video, go out there and see if you can't break that high score on your favorite game. Have fun, guys.